They accomplished so much with the men and women by their side who really, really took the nonviolent approach. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this adds on to history and how this inspires the current generation of activists, because yet again, we are at the height of another movement.
When I think about Congressman Lewis, I also think about the 5th Congressional District. And, you know, he had been reelected 16 times. You know, every time he was over 70% of the vote, I think, through every election going back, 34 years. And among the really incredible aspects of this is the 5th District is not like a lot of places around America where that district is pretty much as it was 34 years ago. The 5th District in Atlanta is Midtown, it's in town, it's West Atlanta. I mean, think about how different Midtown and in town is in 2020 as opposed to the way it was when he defeated Julian Bond back in 1986. I mean, his district has changed probably more dramatically than any other place I can think of in the United States. And through all of that change that we saw, not only in terms of demographics, in terms of population shifts, in terms of buildings that were there now that weren't then, and all of the great construction, the renaissance of the neighborhoods, the one constant through all of this has been Congressman Lewis and his ability to touch his constituents. If you talk to anybody in the 5th Congressional District, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you know John Lewis, and you've seen him in the district, and you know he's listening, and he was never too much of a national figure not to be concerned with whatever was going on in Virginia Highland or Morningside or Sherwood Forest or Ansley or West Atlanta or Vine City or any of these places where he always was listening to what was going on in those neighborhoods, and he was always responding. And that is one of the great legacies. I mean, there's so many great legacies that we have been left with Congressman Lewis, but listening to people, no matter what was going on, serving his 5th Congressional District is extraordinary, of which we will not see again.
And last weekend, Jeff, I hate to put you on the spot, but you sent me a very touching text message last weekend, and we barely communicate with one another on our weekends, but we were talking about this possibility as rumors had started to swirl last weekend that this was reality, and it turned out that it wasn't. And you even said in that message last week that you couldn't imagine what this city would even look and feel like without his presence after all of these years.
Yeah, when you drive on the Grady interchange down there and you see the great mural that says Hero, and John Lewis is this towering figure on the side of a building, I think that pretty much sums it up. Thinking of Atlanta without John Lewis is just impossible, whether you think of Ambassador Young or you think about John Lewis. I mean, this city is defined by their work, their lives, what they have accomplished in their lives, and modern Atlanta in large part, these men are responsible for. I mean, we talk so much about Dr. King and Dr. King's legacy in Atlanta, and Dr. King's been gone since 1968. Certainly not his message, not his speeches, not what he stood for, but Ambassador Young and Congressman Lewis have been here in Atlanta, and they have been battling on issues small and large, of business, of social change, of issues that were so important to so many neighborhoods. Right now on the phone with us is Ambassador Andrew Young. And Ambassador Young, Jeff Hullinger here. I'm very glad to have you with us on such a difficult night into a difficult morning.
Well, it really isn't a difficult night. And it's not a difficult night because death is not the end. And the difference between life and death is a very fine line. And just as Martin Luther King has been with us, he's not been gone for 50 years. He's been in our lives. He's been with us. He's been spiritually a part of everything that's been going on here. And it'll be that way with John and CT. And particularly their wives. And I think that it's, well, I almost look at it as a celebration. There have been very few lives that have been as powerful and as meaningful and have contributed as much to the world and to this nation and to our Southland and black and white people alike, Christians and Jews and Muslims alike. They have been lovers of humanity. And John, I think, demonstrates a kind of power that's very hard to understand. But he was the most genuinely humble man I think I've ever known. But that humility for him was real power, because I saw it work with the Congress, I saw it work in the demonstrations, I saw it attracting young black people to follow him, but I also saw him break down barriers with white people, just with the sheer force of his spirit. He was not an angry man, he was not a bitter man, he had a very wry sense of humor, but you kind of got the impression that he loved everybody and wanted everybody to love him, but he wouldn't compromise his principles for that. And he lived his life all the time I knew him that way.
What do you think how will Atlanta view him 50 years from today, Ambassador Young? What do you think is his legacy, large and small, in the city that he loves so much?
Well, I think that, well, I don't know. We don't know. I think that the city still thinks that all of the things that have happened here just happened accidentally. They don't realize that it was the intentional love and sacrifice and vision to make this city more like the kingdom of God that that we carried with us in everything that we did. And I hope by that time we'll realize that Atlanta is a city that advocated peace and nonviolence and helped people who were different to love each other and to work together and to disagree without being disagreeable. And they are extremely good role models that the world needs, because I don't know. Well, we had 6 Presidential Medal of Freedom winners in this neighborhood almost. Atlanta has 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners. That's not accidental. Look, I think that people talk about Martin Luther King, but they don't even talk about President Carter. And we still don't appreciate that the nonviolent spirit, the fact that we change the world without hatred, without bitterness, without rancor. And we change the world by loving the hell out of them.
You served in Congress, and when John Lewis beat Julian Bond in 1986 and upset him, many people thought Julian Bond would roll over him.
Exactly.
To be
that's when we saw the power of humility. But it was also that John outworked Julian. And John reached out when we were having tensions between the black and Jewish community. John got together with Sherry Frank and Rabbi Rothschild. or maybe it was Rabbi Sugarman then, and formed the Christian-Jewish association, the Black Jewish Association, and it never got in the newspapers, and nobody knew what was going on. John very seldom came home on weekends after his wife died, because he was almost always going to some other district to campaign for some of his colleagues. And that was the reason why he had so much influence in the Congress, because everywhere in America people respected John Lewis. And so any congressman that could get him to come to his district could get votes.
You never know. You never know when a great man is going to flourish in political office. Would it have surprised you in 1986 to know that John Lewis would hold on to that seat in the 5th Congressional District for 34 years, that nobody will ever come close to him? He would garner 70% of the vote during most of the elections, and that he would blossom into the kind of congressman not only here in Atlanta and not only in the Southeast, but around the nation as well?
You know, it wouldn't have surprised me, because John was that kind of workaholic. But he was also that kind of spiritual power that I said if I was writing a book about him, I'd write, the title would be The Power of Humility, because he was genuinely humble, and people mistake humility for weakness. But he demonstrated the power of humility, and he won people over, people who violently would disagree with him. But he never was disagreeable, and he made you love him because he always loved you.
Do you remember the first time you met him?
Yeah, I met him down in Tennessee while he was still a student at Fisk. But I met him first on television. He was on the NBC white paper on the Nashville sit-in story, and I was working in New York. And it was watching that story and watching John Lewis and the others that made me sell my house and quit my job and come to Atlanta.
We want to run a piece right now, and we'd like you to hang on just for a couple of minutes with us.
Okay.
This is Congressman Lewis in his own words. And Ambassador Young, if you would listen to this, I want to get your reaction to it afterwards. Here's Congressman Lewis in his own words.
1963 was a very unbelievable, disturbing year. There was so much discontent all over America. Governor Wallace had been inaugurated as the governor of Alabama.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
When I saw what was happening in Birmingham, it was unreal, unbelievable. I never thought that it could happen any place in America, that you can see fire hoses really picking up young people, including children, and dropping in. And the fire hoses was strong enough to take bark off of trees, or seeing young children being chased by police dogs. America wept in shame. People couldn't take it. I remember the morning of the bombing of the church. I was home visiting my relatives in Alabama. And I got a call from the office here in Atlanta saying, go to Birmingham. And I made it to Birmingham, and my friend Julian Bond, who was the communication director for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, met me there. And the two of us stood across the street from the church, not saying a word to each other, just standing there, almost in a prayerful mood. It was a sad and dark hour. September 1963. It would be fair to say, because of what happened in Birmingham, it was a greater commitment, a greater sense of dedication, a greater sense of stick-to-itness that we have to do it. We cannot allow the death of these 4 little girls be in vain. In November, President Kennedy is assassinated, and I feel like during that period something died in all of us. I was stunned, I was shocked. You know, I met him twice. I saw him from a distance when he was campaigning. I admired him, I loved him. For a long while after the assassination, I collected Kennedy $50.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
He inspired me. He inspired me. He would listen. He was a sympathetic referee in the struggle for civil rights.
John Lewis, in his own words. We are joined by Ambassador Andrew Young on the phone. Ambassador, as you watched that and you listened to those words, what was running through your mind?
That this is a real power. It's the power of humility. It's the power of the Spirit. And that's the power that has changed America. That's the power that helped us with war and without war. I think that we'll learn to appreciate that, as we come through this present crisis. Now, we've got 3 crises that we're dealing with almost. And I think right now, the spirit that John has blessed us with is going to help us in death as he did in life. That Martin Luther King hadn't really gone anywhere. He's still here in the streets of Atlanta. Because he's in the hearts of the people, black and white, young and old. And so will John Lewis and C.T. Vivian.
Ambassador Young, what would you want this next generation of activists and young people who are on the front lines as we are going through very similar situations, what would you want them to take away?
Well, I would want them to study the personalities of these men and study this movement. Go back and read some of the books that we've written and realize how far we were able to come, and that we never lied, we never cheated, we never stole, we were never angry or bitter. We were just quietly determined, and nobody demonstrated that any better than John Lewis.
Ambassador, as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking, we always frame John Lewis in the context of his 34 years representing the 5th District. But between 1981 and 86, he was on City Council, Atlanta City Council, and you dealt with him as mayor. What was it like dealing with him on the minutia of Atlanta city government, whether it's water issues or police or whatever?
He was determined, and the biggest thing, the only time we disagreed was he had made a commitment against roads, no new roads. And we went on and we got the votes without him, but he had given his word to his constituents that he would not vote for roads. So, but he knew that we needed Georgia 400. He knew that we needed the Presidential Parkway, and it gave me great pleasure to put his name on one of the roads that he voted against. And when I drive through Atlanta and I see the Jimmy Carter Library and the John Lewis Free Parkway and Andrew Young International Boulevard, I feel really good. That's my ego trip. Let me go to CNN in Washington for a minute.
Got it.
But I'll be around tomorrow.
We thank you so
Thanks,
much
and
for the
God bless you.
time.
We thank you,
Okay,
Ambassador
bye-bye.
Young, as always, for your great time and your remarkable life and your memories of the great man, John Lewis, who passed tonight. And it is going to be a very different Atlanta without John Lewis.
It is remarkable to think of all that he accomplished. When we talk about the March on Washington in 1963, he was a man in his 20s, 23 years old, speaking at the March on Washington, Jeff. And I think a lot of us, you know, we think about what we were doing at that time. He started this journey at such a young age and was able to accomplish so much. If you look at his bio, it is long. You can just keep scrolling and scrolling. And looking on social media tonight, it's interesting at the wide range of demographics that know him and his quotes and talking about keeping up good trouble. So I love that so many people were in tune with his work, and now so many more people, like Ambassador Young instructed, will now go back to study his work as well.
Well, you talk about him beginning young, and you can also take it to this point that he worked all the way up to the end of his life too. I mean, he is someone who clearly could have retreated. He could have retired. He could have gone on the speaking tour around the country. There were so many Democrats in Congress and the Senate and governors who wanted him to come there and speak on his behalf. We see that with John Ossoff. I mean, John Ossoff's demonstrative ad that he is running for the U.S. Senate is, you know, about 75% John Lewis. John Lewis's pull is just that much, not only home but away. But this is a man who worked, as you mentioned, as a young person, and all the way to the final months of his life.
And what's important about that is the giving back aspect, really inspiring many generations that came behind him. I mean, it was no matter how busy Congressman Lewis was, he just really always had time for the young people and to really mentor them in the ways of that nonviolent resistance. Never wavered, even though he was arrested more than 40 times, still stuck to nonviolent resistance.
More than 9 years ago, 11 Alive arranged for some of our employees and their children to meet and learn from this great man. And this is a poignant exchange. 10-year-old Paris Whitney asked the congressman for a personal account of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama.
Tell me, when you look at this picture, how do you feel?
When I look at that picture, I feel like we're standing at a point of no return. We could not turn back. We had been planted there by some force, maybe by history itself, but we couldn't turn back. We had to do it. Because people in Selma, Alabama, in other parts of the state, other parts of the American South could not register to vote simply because of the color of their skin. When we were marching from Selma to Montgomery and we crossed the bridge, I was walking beside a young man by the name of Jose Williams. And as we walked to the highest point on that bridge, down below we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. And we kept walking. We came within a hearing distance of the State Troopers. And a man said, "This is an unlawful march."
You have to disperse, your orders to disperse, go home or go to your church. This march will not continue.
And Jose said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." They started pushing us and beating us. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick and was knocked down and left unconscious. All these years later, I don't recall, I made it back across that bridge, through the streets of Selma, back to that little church. But I do recall being back at the church. I think someone probably literally carried me back to the church. And they asked me to say something to the audience. There were more than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get in. The church was full. And I stood up and said something like, I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desires to register to vote. The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to a local hospital in Selma.
You're a very brave man.
Well, I'm not sure whether I was brave or not. I just tried to do what I thought was right and tried to be part of an effort to make our country different and make it possible for all of our citizens to become registered voters.
May I have a hug?
Yes, yes, for me. Thank you so much.
Oh my.
I mean, thinking about the impact, I was thinking like, where is Paris now? And knowing that she has that memory and just the storytelling ability to make us feel like we were there. Even just watching that now, Jeff, it was just piercing.
The daughter of Keith Whitney, a very fine reporter for us, many, many years at 11 Alive, and such wonderful work that he did at this television station over the years. And to have that moment of his daughter with Congressman Lewis is something that they will cherish for decades and decades to come. Some of the reaction tonight, Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, says from marching in Selma to serving in the House, Representative John Lewis spent his life fighting for civil rights for every single American. He is an American hero and a giant, and we are all better for the good trouble that John Lewis made. Rest in peace, John. Some of the other reaction that we're getting tonight is I'm looking at Twitter right now. We are seeing, let's see here, from Aisha, I'm seeing Elizabeth Warren a moment ago talked about this towering figure in the history of the United States. Here we go. John Lewis was and will always be an American hero and champion for civil rights who inspired us to all make good trouble in the fight for justice. Rest in power, Representative John Lewis.
And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Jeff, you mentioned that one earlier today. She said every day of John Lewis's life was dedicated to bringing freedom and justice to all. May his memory be an inspiration that moves us all to, in the face of injustice, make good trouble necessary trouble.
John Meacham, one of the great writers of Time magazine over the years and so many other publications. Keep the faith, keep the faith. The last words John Lewis said in our last conversation a few weeks ago. May light perpetual shine upon him. I know it will.
And I really love the words of Ambassador Young saying that it wasn't a difficult night and saying, you know, all of the work that they put in, that their spirits were just too big to go along with them at the end of their life. And, you know, riding through the city, you can just feel them and to feel their presence because they were that impactful. The Honorable John Lewis is just a giant. And this one is coming in from Governor Brian Kemp tonight, saying John Lewis changed our world in profound and immeasurable ways. First Lady, the girls and I are praying for all of his loved ones, friends, and colleagues, and during this incredibly difficult time.
This is from the Reverend Bernice King. Farewell, sir. You did indeed fight the good fight and get into a lot of good trouble. You served God and humanity well. Thank you. Take your rest. And that's the first statement, Aisha, from Governor Kemp. You know, I think also as we take a look at some of this, there's the Elizabeth Warren that I was talking about a moment ago, the one that I just read off of Twitter. But you think about when President Obama awarded Congressman Lewis the Medal of Freedom in 2011, he said this of John Lewis, that generations from now, when parents teach their children what is meant by courage, the story of John Lewis will come to mind. And when you think about Congressman Lewis, I mean, here's someone who worked with Dr. King. He knew Rosa Parks. He went to theological seminary, the American Baptist Theological Seminary in 1957 with C.T. Vivian, This man who was influenced by so many that came through his life, and he continued the work decade after decade, Congress after Congress, and again, representing the 5th Congressional District since 1986.
And the Honorable John Lewis, we mentioned, Jeff, we just keep saying this word giant, and that's just one word to describe him. We're not talking about just in Atlanta, but this legacy really went all around the world. He just brought so much courage and relentless focus to the struggle for civil and human rights. He just really put himself and his life. We see those images just on the front lines time and time again, not letting go of the vision that this world could be a better place.
The Congressman's lifetime dedication inspired the Board of Governors of 11 Alive to bestow our highest award upon him. And here's a brief excerpt from our Community Service Awards 5 years ago in 2015 that paid tribute to this ultimate warrior for change.
One day when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. One day when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Glory, glory, oh, glory, glory.
Hands to the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. Once sundown, his spirit is living in us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it goes down, we women and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots be on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. One day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Glory, oh, glory. Hey, glory. Now the war is not over. Victory isn't won, but we'll fight on to the finish. And then when it's all done, we'll cry glory, oh glory. Glory, oh glory.
Selfless now for every man, woman, and child. Even Jesus got his crown in front of a crowd. They march with the torch, we gon' run with it now. Never look back, we done gone hundreds of miles. From dark roads, heroes, to become a hero. Race in the League of Justice, his power was the people. Enemy is lethal, a king became regal. Saw the face of Jim Crow under a bald eagle. The biggest weapon is to stay peaceful. We sing, our music is the that we bleed through. Somewhere in the dream we had an epiphany. Now we right the wrongs in history. No one can win a war individually. Takes the wisdom of the elders and young people's energy. Welcome to the story we call victory. The coming of the Lord, my eyes have seen the glory.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. One day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Glory, oh, glory. Hey, glory, oh, glory. When the
11 alive. This is too much. Too much. Just too much. I'm supposed to be strong, can stand up and fight and in a nonviolent fashion. Supposed to be brave and courageous. But you're making me cry. And I had an executive session with myself earlier. I said, I'm not going to cry. And then you come here and sing glory. Oh, glory. I'm going to cry. This is too much. Thank you. Thank you. The only thing I try to do is to help out. I'm not worthy to be honored, to receiving an award with all these other unbelievable, gifted souls is too much. Growing up in rural Alabama as a young child, I didn't like segregation and racial discrimination. I didn't like the signs that said white only, colored only, white men, white women, colored women, white boys, white girls, colored girls. And I asked my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? And they were, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But an individual like Rosa Parks, 15 years old when I heard of her. The words and leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to find a way to get in the way. So I got in the way. I got in trouble. You know, I just went out there and push and pull. And that's what I try to do every day. Just try to help someone. Try to make things a little bit better. My last arrest, and you saw it on the video, 8 other members of Congress and 200 citizens, we just went out and said we want the Speaker to bring up a comprehensive immigration bill, for we felt it doesn't make sense in our country to have more than 12 million people living in the shadow. That's not right, it's not fair, and it's not just. We have to do something about it. We all come from some other place. The late Philip Randolph used to say from time to time, who was the dean of black leadership during the March on Washington, maybe our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So it doesn't matter whether we're African American or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. We are one people. We're one family. We all live in the same house. Not just the American house, but the world house. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it another way. We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. Each of us must do what we can to leave this little piece of real estate, this little planet, this little spaceship, a little cleaner and a little greener and a little more peaceful for generation yet unborn. 11 alive, thank you. I didn't know you could make me cry, but you did. Thank you.
Powerful night. Let me tell you, I will never forget that evening being in the downtown Marriott Hotel for our 11 Alive Awards, and hearing that speech is one that still makes the hair on your neck stand up. That was a moment to remember, one of those moments in Atlanta working in this occupation that will not be forgotten.
Bringing in another woman tonight who I'm sure has so many memories as well, Reverend Bernice King joining us via phone tonight. We are so thankful that you are with us. When you heard the news and when you think about this day after the news of Reverend C.T. Vivian as well, just tell us what's on your heart today.
You know, one of the things that really came to me once I heard the news about Congressman Lewis, who we in our family affectionately call Uncle John, is that the universe and God is speaking to us in this perhaps the most defining election year of our time, that we must get voting rights right. That the sacrifice that both of those gentlemen made, both of them were beaten for that right to vote. John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and C.T. Vivian on the steps of the courthouse in Selma, Alabama, to say to us today that we've got to correct the Voting Rights Act, and I'm calling on Congress to do that. These two men sacrificed their very lives so that a right would be protected for African American and citizens all across this nation. And just the second thing, that those who still are apathetic and indifferent about voting, that this sacrifice, this is like a loud message that we cannot take for granted the importance of our citizenship right to vote in this country and have our voices be heard. So that's one of the main things that came to me with both of these icons dying today. And the final thing is just that, the movement that they were part of helped to raise the consciousness of this nation. And if I might be frank, the consciousness of this nation is dimming. And with these two icons leaving us today, it's further dimmed. And so I'm hoping that we understand that we have a high responsibility to grab hold to the mantle and the legacy that they now leave behind in the same spirit of my father, to really continue to, be the conscience of this nation. And Uncle John was one of very few who remained consistent, committed to my father's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. He was a true nonviolent warrior to the day he died. And I will remember him as such. I will remember him as always saying, getting into good trouble. But the reason he said good trouble, because he was reminding people that there is a spirit with which you can fight injustice and inequity, and you can do it in love, you can do it in compassion, you can do it in courage, you can do it in strength, you can do it in truth, but you never have to stoop so low to the level of the enemy, the opposition, the adversary. You can win them over with the spirit of nonviolence.
Reverend King, it's Jeff Hullinger. You were 5 years old in 1968 when your father was assassinated. What are your first recollections of John Lewis in your life?
Oh God, that's a hard question. Because, I grew up in and around the King Center. As you know, my mother founded it 2.5 months after my father was assassinated, and all of the movement people were associated and connected in some form or fashion, whether they were board members or they participated in our nonviolent workshops. I think I remember him first as one of the presenters at our Institute on Nonviolence at the King Center. And that's why I said, the thing that stands out for me most about him is the person who really, remained very consistent to those teachings throughout his entire life and service in Congress.
You're an Atlantan, and you've grown up here. The thought of John Lewis not being part of the city, whether it's as a civil rights leader, as a city councilman in the 1980s, as the representative of the 5th District, as someone who always showed up at charity events, there's so many stories of John Lewis, of just being, look, John Lewis is someone who saved in town from the great road disaster that the government wanted to push through. When you talk about John Lewis in Morningside and Virginia Highland, places like that. You talk about I-475. He was on the right side of that when nobody else was. He was going to bat for those neighborhoods to make sure that they were not destroyed. And for that, in town and midtown will always be grateful on just a level of minutia of politics, of preventing what would have changed our lives here with that road.
Yeah, I think Midtown, Atlanta, Georgia, the nation, and the world should be grateful that he was consistent that way. I mean, there are very few elected officials who are congruent with what they believe and who are consistent in terms of standing on the right side of justice and peace and, equity. And he was that person. He was solid that way. He was just a solid servant of God, and had such a pure heart. And I heard Ambassador Young talking tonight on CNN. He had a lot of humility. And what's missing so often in leadership today is that trait of humility. I mean, humility is what really makes you great.
Yeah.
And so we thank God for his example. He was an incredible example of leadership. And there will be a serious void left in our hearts and in our city and in our state and our nation.
Reverend Bernice A. King, we greatly appreciate your insight and being up with us early on this Saturday morning on such a very sad morning, but celebrating a life like none other, the remarkable John Lewis, who has passed away in the last couple of hours.
And so many thoughts are coming in. We're going to share a couple of them with you right now that we've been gathering. This one is from Senator David Perdue saying, "No one embodied the word courage better than John Lewis. As a civil rights icon, John inspired millions of Americans to fight injustice and reject the status quo. Without a doubt, his wisdom and even as a pastor," this is coming from Reverend Raphael Warnock. We heard from him earlier about C.T. Vivian. He said, "As his pastor, I was honored to be with him as he crossed his final bridge with the same faith and courage." This one coming in, continuing from Reverend Raphael Warnock, saying, "Today the world lost a giant. I lost a mentor, a church member, and a friend in his youth. John Lewis wrestled with the call to ministry, but instead of preaching sermons, he became a sermon for all the world to see. His life was a sermon."
What a life. Amazing. And we will have so much more coming your way on 11alive.com and during our broadcast this weekend, which will be all about John Lewis and what he has meant to our city, to our state, to our region, to our nation, and for that matter, the world.
We thank you for staying up late with us tonight and tuning in. And Jeff, thank you for staying along with me too and bringing the historic perspective with 11 Alive that we all so much love from you as well.